I am joined by Dawn Adams, midwife and diabetes advocate. How exactly would you describe what you do, Dawn? And thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I do work as a midwife, and I do a lot of work in the advocacy space for women living with diabetes. I had formerly been a researcher, and I had some published work on that as well. So yeah, mostly advocacy work with a side helping of research.
Okay, so you started off looking into diabetes in pregnancy, right? And you've sort of moved seamlessly into looking into diabetes in menopause because you yourself are a type 1 diabetic. Can you tell me and the listeners a little bit about how you got into this work?
I think it all goes back to the point of diagnosis, where when I asked about pregnancy, because I was in my early 20s, I was advised 2 children should be the most. When asked about menopause, because my mum was at that stage in her life and I was becoming increasingly aware that this was a thing back in the early 1990s, I was told I probably wouldn't live that long, and if I did, I would have had a surgical menopause by that stage, not to worry about it. So being the very compliant individual that I am, I went on to have 4 children, and following the birth of my 4th son, I then started to notice changes in menstrual patterns, and I think that was probably the beginning of my menopause journey. The introduction of glucose sensors, insulin pumps, meant I was seeing things and being curious as well. I wasn't able to find information about any of the things that I was seeing or any of the things that I was experiencing. So it kind of happened that I just came into the space at the right time with diagnosis and with life events. So life is a bit messy as it is. My life was messy with an added layer of interest and data. So that was how I ended up here.
We know on Standard Issue we talk about this sort of stuff all the time. We talk about the research gap quite a lot. We talk about medical misogyny quite a lot. And we know, as it is something that is really only in the last couple of years being talked about in a public kind of way, I guess, menopause is massively under-researched, but even more so for women with type 1 diabetes, right? So I was reading your paper and it points out menopause is associated with metabolic dysfunction, weight gain, impaired insulin sensitivity, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia. I'm not entirely sure what that is, but I guess it's to do with cholesterol levels, right? Now, these are all things that are very bad for people with diabetes, right? And then things like sleep patterns, mood, cardiac and vascular health, physical health, all impact on glucose stability or instability. And then on top of that, you are more at risk of developing diabetes whilst you are going through or coming out the other side of menopause. My mum's a type 1 diabetic, so I have thought about diabetes quite a bit before, but I never thought about menopause and diabetes. And when you look at all of these things written in your paper, it's like, what? I mean, this is obviously going to be something that we need to know more about, like we need to know something about, right? So this is probably quite an obvious answer, but why don't we know anything about it?
I think the very obvious answer to this is, as I said earlier, women are messy, very messy. And that's probably why when University College or Imperial College London did their research into how much of a research budget was spent on women's health issues, they came back with 2% of all research undertaken globally focuses primarily on the health of those born female. That's from conception to the grave. And when you take it that type 1 diabetes is 8 to 10% of all diabetes in the UK, but 6 to 14% at a global level, that's a very small proportion of people living with any type of diabetes. So it's a smaller proportion of women living anywhere globally. When you try to put that figure into a 2% research budget, it's coming out 0.000. It's very small numbers. That would be why. And as I keep hearing at diabetes conferences, most people with type 1 diabetes don't live long enough to be able to do additional research into things that we know within general populations. So when you're living at the thin end of the wedge, and when you're a woman living at the thin end of the wedge, getting research into any specific autoimmune conditions is going to be incredibly challenging. There is more research out there on type 2 diabetes and menopause and the impact of menopause on the likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes because the numbers are bigger. When you live with type 1, you're, say, sitting in a smaller subset again. But even the research on type 2 diabetes and menopause, it's good, but it's not as good as it could be or should be to effectively support people living through that phase in life with both conditions going simultaneously.
Autoimmune conditions are not that well researched in general, but I believe that autoimmune conditions are more prevalent in women. Is that right? Yeah.
And we don't know why.
It's so frustrating. It's so frustrating. Yeah. The technology in treatment of diabetes has come on an insane amount in the last sort of 10 years or so, hasn't it? Like my mum has a patch that she wears on her arm now that tells her blood sugar at all times, basically, and you can get like an artificial pancreas, can't you, now, that sort of puts insulin into your bloodstream, right? So it's like a pack that you wear and it does it all for you, so you don't have to faff around with injections and whatnot. But this technology has also enabled women to see some of the things that they thought were going on but couldn't prove, right? Can you tell me a bit more about that?
I have a glucose sensor similar to your mum. I have an insulin pump, and before I got the glucose sensor, it seemed that my insulin pump, which I've had for 12 years, wasn't quite functioning as well as it could or it should in the week before a period. I was particularly insulin resistant, and finger prick readings were telling me that I wasn't getting enough insulin. I was able to bolus more insulin with the pump. And the week after a period, I was particularly insulin sensitive. I did try having a conversation with my male endocrinologist about this, and he just looked at me and said, that isn't a thing. And I came away from that appointment thinking, this is so a thing. And I knew that there was something just not adding up in what he was saying and what I was experiencing. But when I got the glucose sensor, I could so totally see that the week before a period was one of extreme insulin resistance. And it didn't matter what I ate. It didn't matter how much I slept. It didn't matter how far I walked. It didn't matter how many hours I worked. It didn't matter how much water I drank. My insulin was just like tap water at that point in the game. And the week after, it was as if all that insulin that I had been given the previous week suddenly decided to work with 10 times its usual effect. So then I started having conversations with my now female endocrinologist, changed endocrinologists in that period of time. And she said, I don't know anything about this. Try this information leaflet, which just said, check your blood glucose levels more regularly and adjust your insulin accordingly. I was already wearing a sensor that was reading minute-by-minute readings. I was already using an insulin pump, bolusing, not bolusing, reducing my basal rates, background insulin rates, all the things that your pancreas does, the pump does, and still not quite coming up with the answers that I was looking for, or not coming up with the glucose stability that I so desired. For me, that was a real watershed moment in my journey. It explained what had been going on in the previous 20 years of my diagnosis. I was seeing it there in hard data, and I started to ask more questions, but there were no answers because the glucose sensor technology was still very new and nobody was looking at the impact in women. When you look at research, 98% of research in people is carried out in men. But out of that research, a significant proportion of it is carried out in white men aged between 18 and 40. So statistics weren't there even for glucose sensor data outside of that population. And I found it really interesting at a conference last year in Hamburg, where they were talking about the accuracy of blood glucose sensors that are so popularised now, and how women were excluded from that data because their data was noisy. Their data was changing the accuracy of the devices and making the numbers less favourable. They didn't know what was making the data so noisy for women. For males, the data was sitting with a long-term glucose average of 0.5% to 1% lower for males than it was for females. But the female daily patterns, weekly patterns, monthly patterns were not as stable. And it didn't matter the age, the ethnicity, the activity levels, the type of insulin, the data wasn't as stable from female populations to male populations.
Now, sorry, Dawn, because I'm going to say something again that's quite obvious now. But is that not in itself a point worth further investigation?
It is. I was very fortunate that I was approached by a glucose sensor company and asked about my experiences. So I've spoken on a number of podcasts and interviews around menopause and diabetes that were funded by this particular sensor company. And again, I go to diabetes conferences regularly. They were talking about the changes that they're now seeing whenever they include the female sensor data to see how they can develop the glucose sensor technology to allow for that messiness. But I think the fact that the sensor companies are now working with insulin pump manufacturers globally, there is something in their research interest to be able to say that their sensor reads more accurately at numbers outside of the expected glucose ranges, and that the insulin pump companies that they're working with can allow for that and deliver insulin appropriately, because there's increased inaccuracy in glucose sensors once you go above a blood glucose reading of 14 or once you go below a blood glucose rating of 3.5 to 4, depending on which sensor you're using.
So, to clarify, this became of interest to them when they realised it would make them more profitable, basically. They would be able to sell themselves as being more accurate.
Inclusive, I think, is the word
okay.
You're probably
Inclusive.
Looking for.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that in itself is fascinating, isn't it? Fortunately, for people who are living with diabetes now, some work is actually being done around this, and you are helping out with that work, aren't you? So you're helping to design a project that may or may not get off the ground in England, but there is a piece of research that you are about to finish recruitment of as we record this, and that's with Ulster University. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that research piece?
So following on from the citizen science research project that you had mentioned that I was involved in earlier, I'd had a phone call from a researcher in Ulster University, Professor Vivian Coates, who's done a lot of work into women's health. And she had tried to submit research already to Diabetes UK for funding, and it hadn't got over the line at any point in time. So she talked to me about my experiences. She asked if I knew anyone with type 2 diabetes. I have a number of friends who have type 2 diabetes who were born female, and we came together, had a conversation about what her previous projects had been rejected because of. And we felt that it would be really helpful to start with a very basic question. What are the differences that women with diabetes experience around the time of menopause compared to women with no diabetes? Because the no diabetes control population is much bigger. The type 2 diabetes population is significant. The type 1 diabetes is proportionately smaller. And for the purposes of inclusion, we felt that because there's not a huge amount known about non-white women and diabetes, or non-white women and menopause, we joined up with Equity, who represent women of colour, and we joined up with Sisters Group. We joined up with various social media platforms, and we pulled together a research project that was going to cover the impact of menopause and diabetes, or the impact of diabetes on the experience of menopause, to identify what's unique to women with diabetes and what is normal menopause experience. So far, we've managed to get a systematic literature review almost completed. And again, that has pointed out a lot of the things that the research paper I had done had pointed out a lot of the things that we see women who are not from white communities identifying on a regular basis across social media platforms and across different channels. And we have now reached the stage of the recruitment. It is coming to an end because it is a time-limited project, but it is available on different social media platforms. So please do go and look for Ulster University, diabetes, menopause, and sign up. I'm sure that there will be additional rounds of recruitment. So I think people coming in at any stage is really helpful, and trying to get as broad a representation as we possibly can. And hopefully we'll start to answer some more of the questions, because my heartfelt belief is that women entering the research, by the time it's finished recruiting, if they have a familial history of diabetes, if they have a history of gestational diabetes, there's a high chance that women who come into this research project without diabetes may be leaving it with pre-diabetes or with a diagnosis of type 1 or type 2, simply because of the life stage that they're at, and because, as we've already said, that hormonal activity going on. And I think being involved in any research project is very empowering. It gives you a greater insight, and it makes you more aware of what's being done, what isn't being done, and what should be done. And the additional research project that I'm involved with, I know will have strands coming into it, which will be recruiting across the UK in the coming years. So it's worth watching out. If it's something that people are interested in, I think the more knowledge we have, the more powerful we become.
I want to ask you a little bit about representations of diabetes. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the film Steel Magnolias. Do you?
Yes.
Right. So you know what I'm going to ask you about, basically. So we watched this on the podcast a few weeks ago, because we have a section called Rated or Dated. And we know that women with diabetes have children all the time, and, you know, it all works okay. But I also know that some of the things that happen to the character on the film, like, my mum was brought up, I would say, with a degree of shame about her condition, because she was 9 years old when she was diagnosed. This is like 1957, when obviously this is not something that people necessarily knew so much about. And things like her parents would sort of say to my dad, oh, you know, there's a lot, isn't it? You know, she probably won't be able to have kids, you know, like, gee, is that what you want for yourself, kind of thing. Now, obviously, pretty nasty work by them. That aside, when I was watching the film, I was thinking to myself, in 1989, diabetes is a very, very treatable, manageable condition, as long as you are getting the correct treatment for it, right? Yeah. Although I know also it is based on a true story. The guy that wrote it, his sister did actually die of complications related to diabetes. But I was saying on the podcast, I was like, to my mind, that seems like a very, very outdated view of living with diabetes. I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
I remember crying when I watched it. I watched it not that long before I was diagnosed, and I cried whenever I saw Shelby having the hypo in the hairdressers. I cried whenever Shelby then died of kidney complications following the birth of her son. And then, say, 4 years later, that was me now living my life through Shelby's experiences. The shame is still very much a thing. Shame and stigma are still something. Things that people live in with all types and any types of diabetes experience on a regular basis. Can you eat that? Should you eat that? Why are you eating that? Are you hypo? What made you hypo? Are you hyper? What made you hyper? Have you not taken enough insulin? Have you taken too much insulin? You're constantly policed by other people who are coming from probably a place of concern, but also a lot of judgment. And it's very difficult to manage that on a daily basis. So the shame that's there still stands. And so what we were saying again about Shelby and the complications in Steel Magnolias, deaths in America to people with type 1 diabetes quite often happen in the years that they turn 27 or 28. Because if they live in a family which is able to afford health insurance at the age of 26, the person with type 1 diabetes then has to fund their own health insurance. They're not covered under their parents' healthcare scheme. They're now seen as fully adult, fully responsible. So your 26th birthday, you're no longer on your parents' healthcare insurance. And there's a charity called Insulin for All, which was set by the mother of one young man who on his 26th birthday was removed from the family's insurance, not by choice, but because that's the way it works. He didn't have full-time work. He wasn't able to afford healthcare insurance, and he was dead before his 27th birthday. And stories like that keep coming up from friends in America, sharing them on a regular basis. It's still happening. So when we see Shelby's complications, it wasn't because of lack of access to healthcare. It was as much due to the way that the healthcare system is structured in other countries. And it's also due to the fact that the insulins that we have now, which are much more similar to insulin that the beta cells in the pancreas are making on a normal functioning healthy pancreas, older insulins were less stable. They were less predictable. So complications tended to be more frequent in the past. I look at friends who were diagnosed around the same time as your mum, who are now in their mid-70s, late 70s. And I just think, wow, those are the people that I want to be, because they survived with testing their urine to see what their glucose was. First thing in the morning, yeah, they were getting their glucose levels over the previous 8 hours in one hit. They're using insulins, which we don't use anymore anywhere in the world. They're not manufactured anymore. And I look at them and I go, if I manage to do as well in my life and live as well as you have, I come from such a place of privilege, living within the NHS, having access to the technologies, having access to the peer support, I'll be doing well.